Good morning and welcome. Thank you very much to everyone who's joined us this morning for the Response Source webinar on tackling diversity in journalism. We appreciate it's an exceptionally busy time for everyone, but it's going to be a really interesting and important discussion today, so thank you again for your time. My name is Natalie Orange. I'm CMO at Response Source, and I'm going to be chairing the conversation today, and I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. We're joined by Angela Henshall, who's Partners Manager at the 50/50 Project, Will Gore, who's Head of Projects and Partners at the NCTJ, Professor Diane Kemp, who's a Professor of Broadcast Journalism at the BCU, BJTC, and also the Sir Lenny Henry Centre for Media Diversity, and lastly, Leon Mann, founder of the Black Collective for Media and Sport. Welcome to everyone.
Hello.
I'd like to say to all of our listeners who are dialed in, thank you again for your time. If you'd like to join the conversation, please do so via Twitter using our Diversity in Journalism hashtag, or via our LinkedIn and Twitter channels, or by emailing resources@responsesource.com, or more immediately just sending through your questions through the Ready Talk platform, and I'll make sure we share those with our speakers today. So to kick us off, the first question I'd like to open with is really to almost hand over to Diane to almost set the scene. How and why is journalism improved when it's representative? Over to you, Diane.
Okay, it's an interesting question, that, isn't it? Because actually, I'm going to flip it round and say, why would we not think that journalism, which is in the end about telling us what's happening in our world, it's about reflecting the events that are important to us about our world, how in any vision of journalism could it be that actually if you made the people who worked in that area only come from a particular part of the demographic, how would that make it a success? It just doesn't work. We do know that actually for us to find the right stories, we need to know the right people. Who you know is what you know, and if you only know a particular type of person, people like us, whoever the us is, you're pretty much doomed. I mean, you have to work very hard to get out of that particular place. So I think it's actually more a case of it's for all of us here, and everybody I would have thought tuning in for this webinar, absolutely the obvious thing that if you have a diverse workforce working in journalism, you are much more likely going to service the ends of producing good, strong journalism. You're going to reflect the stories back to the people who make up the world you're broadcasting to. So I honestly think it's a no-brainer. It's not even for us to question, because there doesn't seem to me to be any decent argument against it.
Thank you. Angela, that's obviously sort of setting the scene as to how and why it's so important, but why is it still that then diversity still has to be so sort of front and centre when we're thinking about how newsrooms are structured and actually, news agenda as a whole put together? Why is it still so sort of front and centre to that planning piece?
I think it needs to come in really early into the process. If I can kind of talk about what happened with the 50/50 project. So it was a project that came from the newsroom at the BBC itself, and the producers and the reporters that were on the front line, like they are at the moment, covering coronavirus. And I think it was a feeling in the newsroom that we were kind of being in a constant state of trying to make our stuff more diverse, trying to include more women. And there was a feeling that you kind of accept a goal that's desirable and accept it's not possible. And I think the 50/50 project worked hard to create proof that it is possible, and that is an effective way of persuading others to take this on, that you can structure this and you can kind of bring in a system of collecting data and moving things on and tracking. I think it's been a phenomenal success story at the BBC, and I would strongly encourage people to feel positive about that. I think that, as Diane was mentioning, the argument has moved on. It's not why should we do diversity, it's more what should we be doing and how do we practically bring this into newsrooms.
That's really interesting. The point around data and evaluation, that seems to be really fundamental to the success of programs. Well, is that something that you've seen in your experience?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think you have to be very careful that when you are taking measures to improve diversity and inclusion in media organisations, that you are actually making a difference. And I think, certainly it's our experience with at the NCTJ, with the Journalism Diversity Fund that we manage, that you can measure the impact it's having, because you see the individuals who we support to undertake their professional qualifications actually moving into the industry. So I think you've always got to be very, very careful in terms of evaluating projects that arise, and not doing them for the sake of them, and not doing them to kind of tick a corporate box. I think that there is sometimes the danger that can happen, and actually it seems to me that one of the important points to always bear in mind is that we need to think about the sort of sense of diversity as being differences in viewpoint as much as anything else, and differences in the way people think. So it's not simply saying, oh well, I work for X news organisation and I want more people of this background just because I want to make the newsroom look better. Really, you should be thinking, well, I want more people from a whole variety of backgrounds who will bring their experiences to bear on the newsroom, not just sit there and be told how the newsroom operates and to follow that lead.
Mm.
Mm. And
I think.
Go on, sorry.
I was going to chip in on the data side of things. It's been absolutely invaluable for us. I think previously where schemes maybe fail is when they haven't involved the people making the news. And we all know that collecting data isn't an end in itself, but it's just a tool for changing how you behave. And I would definitely say that that's what happened at the 50/50 project. We went from kind of a smattering of teams who were clocking the number of men and women in their output. It spread very quickly across news. We had 90% of news within a few months, and now we've scaled it to more than 600 teams across the BBC. So it is phenomenally useful as a way of changing behavioural kind of approaches. You're really unlikely to make progress on this if you don't know how you're doing through tracking. And everything you do has to make a difference to what the content is. It has a chance to kind of influence behaviour of people if you're exposed to that data and that balance in what you're producing every day. I think we're doing this not just to tick boxes, as kind of mentioned. It's really, at the BBC, it's really about making the journalism and the content better. And I think if you're reporting and analysing your world, and you only speak to some of that world, you're really restricting your ability to produce really good journalism.
Can I add to that? Because tomorrow sees the launch of our Sir Lenny Centre for Media Diversity at Birmingham City University. And part of the reason for wanting to have this centre was that sense that, hang on, we have been here so often before, what are we missing? And I absolutely agree, it is about that sense, well, a number of things, but one of them is, are we actually analysing all the data that we get? There's loads of really interesting projects, diversity initiatives, loads of different things over the years, but there is a slight sense, I think, from quite a few of us who have been around a while, that we're missing an institutional memory on it, that somehow, 15 years later, something will be tried again, and if it wasn't properly evaluated the first time, it might be tried again because it's a great idea, but we've never really kind of closed that loop and thought, if you look at the stats, it didn't do so well, why don't we make it different and learn from that? So actually the centre, one of the main things it wants to do is to collate all of that data. So the 50/50 stuff, absolutely phenomenal project. But to look at all of that and to try and do some sort of meta-analysis of where does that leave us, but also to capture that institutional memory from people who have seen it happen a number of times, so that we can learn from what's worked and really put aside the stuff that hasn't.
And Leon, on that point around sort of institutional memory and learning from what's gone before, I mean, obviously there's quite a unique experience of sport, and in some ways sport is a bit further ahead on this journey. What's your view on the importance of learning from what's gone before?
Well, it's absolutely essential to learn about what's gone on before, share good practice. Within the kind of sports media context, which is the only space I can talk about. I've worked in sport my entire life as a sports journalist, also as an anti-racism campaigner. And, we've seen a shift in attitudes. But when we look around at a commitment that is around funding, around the levels of accountability, there hasn't been a great shift in our experience in our particular space. And what I mean by that is, we were founded in 2009. I think it's fair to say out of frustration. We basically came together as black sports journalists to discuss why we hadn't seen much progress around that particular area of diversity in our industry. And we began doing things ourselves. We began setting up networking events ourselves. We began lobbying the most senior bosses in the industry. And today we find ourselves moving to a position where we can offer some kind of informal, so it's not academic, but some really useful training just in terms of those skills such as connecting people with the right people in the industry, inspiring them and connecting them with people who look and sound like them. So we're learning all the time. We've been able to now unlock some funding from the London Mayor in terms of our masterclasses. We've also had conferences where we evaluate data. It will come as no surprise to know that there hasn't been a real shift over the 6 years that we've been monitoring the industry. There has been some shifts in terms of women, but when we look and dig down into that, what we find is these are white women. It's not BAME women. With BAME women, the progress is tiny. And in terms of BAME as a whole, we've actually found that we've gone backwards slightly across the 6 years, which was interesting. So I think this all comes down to leadership for me. I don't want to come across as being too radical, but I don't know if anyone can tell me about a senior leader that's lost their job for not delivering in this area. And until we get to that level of seriousness, we will not move forward.
That's a really good question, actually, Leon. Can I just ask, in terms of your figures, I'm thinking about the figures that were out in the 2016, which was still saying 0.2% of black journalists within the industry. Would that still be what you're thinking from the figures you've seen in sports?
In terms of those exact figures, I'm sorry, I'm literally getting them up right now. Sorry, apologies for everyone listening.
No worries.
In terms of the figures, I mean they've sadly not increased a great deal. However, and I think it's important for me not to be someone who's just spreading doom and gloom on here. We've got enough of that in the world right now. But certainly the attitude has definitely shifted. I spent a significant amount of my time in 2009 explaining why diversity was important. Now, for the last 5 years, I haven't needed to go near that question. It's been a question of what are we doing, how are we doing it, and quite frankly, I'm speaking to organisations, to groups of people who do not have the expertise within their organisations to be able to make the progress in the area that we're working in. So we're being engaged more and more. The challenge for us as a group that's kind of been formed very informally is we've now become a free consultancy. We now deliver expertise, experience, we create all the networking to an industry that literally generates billions in terms of the sports media. However, when it comes to funding us, that hasn't been possible to date. However, the question can be reversed to us. As a group of sports journalists, we're probably not very good at the getting funding side of things. So we need to work on that ourselves. But I think there's a bit of a disconnect there in terms of we've shown through our work that we can make some real progress. However, that hasn't been kind of picked up on by the industry saying, right, we will resource you better to amplify your success and to make sure you're helping us more and more to identify people from these groups that we're struggling with.
I think just to pick up on that point, Leon, you make about that being there has been an attitude shift among news media leaders. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And I think one of the positive sides of that, although, I mean, as you say, there is still a disconnect in terms of funding sometimes, but one of the positive things that certainly we've seen is an increasing number of people from diverse backgrounds, I think, are understanding that this is an industry for them. And I think for a very long time, they felt very much that, well, actually, I look at the TV and I look at who are the editors of all these papers, and it's all a bunch of white middle-class people. And I think that is starting to shift. And certainly the JDF, we've seen an increasing number of people successfully applying for bursaries over the last couple of years. So I think you're seeing that attitude shift at the top having an impact at the bottom in terms of people wanting to get into careers. But I think that the real issue very often is that progression from getting into your first job to attaining a senior role in due course.
I think also we are seeing, some real positives in that people aren't waiting for permission. There's some great, and again, I come back to 50/50 project, some loads of really good examples where people have just thought, I've spotted the issue, I'm not going to wait. This is the same, Leon, with your own example. From if I wear one of my hats, which is with the Broadcast Journalism Training Council, I'm deputy chair. We set up, which is absolutely fantastic, but for the first time for us, a placement assistance scheme, and this is aimed specifically at our socially diverse students who are on our courses, for whom they know they need to do a placement, but actually, it's funding for it is really hard. So with some backing, Google News Initiative, ITV, BBC, and the BJTC putting in funds to it, saying actually, if we're expecting people to do a placement, which we all do, we need to offer them some finance. So we've started that this year, and again, it's just a sense of, right, we can see there's a problem, we need to do something to fix it, because, it's for all of us to step up, frankly.
Yeah, it was very definitely an organic spread of 50/50 once it got going. I think that its origins is definitely a kind of a grassroots movement. I kind of really echo your feeling on kind of trying to get this moving and just kind of stepping up to doing it yourself, really. And when I feel quite inspired actually when I talk to younger journalists and new people coming in, because they really don't need to be told how to do this. They just want a tool to do it. They want a tool to track what they're doing in their own work. And that's why we've decided to spread 50/50 into universities. But similarly, we've been kind of overwhelmed with interest this year, in the last year, because there are so many people looking for almost this kind of consultancy approach to how could they roll this out into their newsrooms. And we're going to start working with a kind of a core set of universities, not just UK, we're going to do it internationally, where we're hoping to equip young people coming into the industry as the future leaders of the industry to bring in these kind of practical tools to start tracking in their daily work. And then, if someone came to me and I was hiring as a news editor, and somebody came in and said, look, I know how to do this 50/50 process. I'm happy to roll it out in the newsroom for you. I can help you adopt this. I'm going to hire them. So I think if we are kind of equipping people to take this forward, I feel very positive about the younger people coming into the industry now. And yeah, you're right. It's this middle group. It's the middle kind of manager level that we really need to be communicating with and making sure that people are progressing through to these middle ranks and not dropping out.
And I think that takes, some courage of leadership in newsrooms to say, well, actually, we are going to explicitly tackle this question of career progression, just as I think some publishers, and we've seen this a little bit in the community news project that we're managing, which Facebook has funded, where publishers explicitly changed recruitment strategies in order to attract more diverse cohort of applicants. I think that same approach needs to happen in terms of career progression. I think actually because the danger is if you don't do that, and talented people lose out on the opportunities which ought to have been open to them, then they end up leaving the industry. And I think that is a key message for all newsrooms. And the truth is that some of the action that can be taken, it needs to be done explicitly, but it can be done in a way that I think is relatively straightforward. It just requires that courage of leadership to tackle it.
Because I'm putting stuff together for centre launch tomorrow, once again looking at a document that Jane Campion wrote in 2005, Look Who's Talking, where she had a number of people who she'd interviewed there talking about it's down to individuals, kind of so-called white knights, not infrastructure. Diversity is seen as a bolt-on. And so you're right, of course it is about individuals who will set the tone in newsrooms, middle managers, whoever you want to say that. But if you leave it down to individuals rather than infrastructure, I mean, that's not shifted us from, say, this is a 2005 report. And that's worrying, I think, isn't it, for all of us, that, these are issues that somehow we are coming round, we're circling round again to them. And although there's some great stuff that's going on, we've all kind of given some examples of them, it's how do we shift it in a much more final way, I feel. Not saying I've got an answer to that, but it's going to take slightly more, I think, than all the things that have been going on previously, because we're reiterating them. And our figures, as we were talking about earlier, haven't improved.
And I think that to your point, Diane, one of the themes that is coming through is just the need for a systemic, long-term approach versus seeing diversity as something that is a quick fix. And then the challenge is, how do you keep it sort of front and centre?
Yeah, I mean, it's never been either or. It seems to me. I can't think of any problem that we've had to solve. Kind of social problem that has only ever had one way of being tackled. So it's not that you don't need those individuals, but if you only rely on them, then of course it's idiosyncratic, isn't it? And good luck if you end up in a newsroom where that person isn't there.
I think that's true of sort of individual companies as well.
So thanks to our listeners. One of them was really to ask for direct advice on someone who was interested in getting into journalism and was maybe representative of minority. What advice you give them for how to launch their career?
I mean, my advice, my advice around this, from experience, from being a black sports journalist on the shop floor, shall we say, at the BBC and also ITV, is get yourself a network. I think that's really, really important. I think you need somebody who has been in your position to be able to bounce questions on situations off. It's hard being in a minority in a very pressured workplace. It's hard in that environment to be your best self, your most confident self. And quite frankly, if you can't be that, then it's going to be very difficult to progress within this industry. That's certainly what I've seen of some very, very good sports journalists fall out of the industry as a result of probably not having a network. And I think that's one of the great things that BComs brings to the table, and lots of other groups, that we provide that network where we have very experienced sports journalists within our ranks, and we also have an understanding of people who've just taken a step into the industry, be it from university or career change, and have learned how to cope with that environment and can also raise things. And also, we've experienced many sports journalists at different levels being able to come to us with a problem that we can raise on their behalf without exposing who they are. So we can take that to the most senior boss within their building and say, there is an issue here that we believe you need to address, and we can help them with that issue and help them address that should that arise.
I think that's right. I think networking is so important, and it's one of the reasons that the JDF introduced a mentoring sort of element to its scheme a couple of years ago. But I think that, it is also important, still, I mean, recognising that journalism, of course, is not a sort of a licensed profession, but nevertheless, I think having a recognised qualification does make an enormous difference. And certainly, I think about 80% of journalists have a journalism qualification of one sort or another, and of those, about 81% have an NCTJ diploma. And certainly, the point of setting up the Journalism Diversity Fund 15 years ago was to make sure that courses, qualifications were accessible to people who would otherwise not be able to afford them. So, in that 15 years, we've managed to support about 347 people through their qualifications and given them that immediate uplift to enter a career with real confidence that they, then kind of newsroom ready when they start.
I mean, I'd absolutely kind of just to say I'd amplify that absolutely, and NCTJ absolutely brilliant. BJTC clearly, I'm going to say for them as well. 54 courses we added around the UK at 37 establishments. Actually, as long as you go to courses that know what they're talking about, you're going to get the kind of support and the language that Leon's just referred to as well. You do need to have the support, I think, A, to get you in, but B, to kind of help you feel like you can maintain yourself while you're there, because things in this industry aren't always straightforward.
I think I was just going to mention something on the networking thing. Once you're in that job and you're potentially feeling that you are a little isolated, you don't know who you're at, where your network is coming from, I think it's important to look widely. I would have said that the best advocates I've had for me were not the people I would have necessarily expected. And certainly in terms of getting the 50/50 project moving, there have been some very surprising evangelists that have come out of the woodwork. It's not necessarily the people that are already kind of, campaigning on kind of women's rights at work and that kind of thing. There are a lot of people who will be on your side or could be an ally through your career and offer you fantastic advice. So I would definitely be open to talking to a broad range of people with different skill sets. And as we were saying, kind of just have confidence to kind of talk to them about what you're doing and how you might be able to move forward.
And I think that's actually the positive that we can take from this.
Yeah.
Actually, 10 years ago, a bit like the Me Too hashtag. A few years ago, these things were mentioned in women's toilets. You'd have a conversation, you'd not mention it outside. And now people do talk about it. We have the language, and that's a very big difference. It's not a cure-all, but it does change things. It moves it on, and I think it does make it harder to put back again, actually, which is good news.
Just one question, maybe, just to kind of wrap up. Sorry, conscious of time, but we've had a few questions come in just about the difference that may be experienced if you're a freelancer versus someone in a newsroom. As we've talked a lot about newsrooms through our conversation, but is there any advice you can give to someone who's a freelancer, and particularly someone, and again we've had Tasneem who's emailed in with a question around being a British Muslim journalist and having a very different experience. Any advice for someone who's a freelancer in that context that you could pass on?
She's probably got a lot of good contacts already, but I mean, absolutely, it's to amplify again what Leon said. Make sure you've got that support network. I mean, there are some great out there who have put their heads above the parapet talking about these things. Make them, whether you're freelance or not. I mean, my experience is that everyone is usually pretty happy to say hello, offer an ear at least, and to join up some dots for you. Again, if you're freelancing, many of my students end up freelancing. It can be a very lonely place to be. So you absolutely need that support, regardless of then any additional issues that you're facing. So do get that support.
I think another thing is that if you're sort of finding it difficult to get the kind of the regular exposure that you would like to in existing platforms, I think there's always merit in really kind of pushing yourself to create your own platform. I mean, the technology we have nowadays means everyone can create their own blog or social media presence or whatever it might be, and really get yourself out there, so that if people are casting around for talented journalists, they will find you as much as you finding them. And I know it kind of sounds like an easy thing, and I know it's much more difficult than that, but I still think finding or creating your own shop window is as important as engaging with other people's.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Would anyone else, is there any sort of final thoughts that anyone would like to leave us with before we wrap up the conversation? Well, on that note then, and I'm sorry, there were some further questions that came in that we haven't got time to answer, but we will pick up in our blog, and also just when we publish this afternoon, we'll include a list of the resources that all of our speakers have shared. It just leaves me to say thank you very much to Angela, Will, Diane and Leon. We really appreciate your time, and thank you to everyone who listened in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Goodbye.